Yeah, so I want to address the other question of the time period of the apostles, and this is something that's very, very important when you're looking at how um, the apostles are addressing issues and the authority of the apostles in the New Testament. We have to recognize the uniqueness of the time period in which the apostles are living. We have living apostles. The New Testament is not written. In the time period where the New Testament is not written, um, the apostles are the authority, just like the prophets were the authority in the Old Testament.
Right.
It's not like you only had to listen to Isaiah when the book of Isaiah was written. No, when he was speaking, it was the prophetic, infallible word of God, and you had to listen when he was speaking prophetically. So the same is the case in the time of the apostles. The question is, what is our authority now after the death of the apostles, right? After John the apostle died, when now we have this canon of New Testament books, where do we look? Okay, where do we look for authority now in that era? That's the question, because that's where we're living now. Jesus isn't walking here with us like he was in the time of the apostles. So the Roman answer to that is going to be the successors of the apostles, whereas we would say the writings of the apostles, right? So it doesn't really answer the question one way or another to point out the fact that the apostles are speaking authoritatively, and they even talked about traditions that they handed on to the churches. And Rome takes those and says, well, look, traditions, therefore Rome, our traditions that have been preserved in the magisterium. But, to say that, it doesn't say that in the text. There's nothing in the text that implies this is a tradition that is passed down to the Bishop of Rome or through the church or in any other way. These are the traditions that the apostles themselves gave. And if you look at someone like Irenaeus, he was writing at the end of the 2nd century, he uses that kind of language of traditions and defines what those traditions are against the Gnostics, who he's writing against in his book Against Heresies. And he defines those traditions as basically what you find in the Apostles' Creed. In other words, it's a summary of the faith that is completely encapsulated in the New Testament itself. So this isn't, additional dogmas or something like that. And then the final thing I want to bring up, because that was a lot, and then I'll go to your question. But the final thing that I want to say is, when you're talking to someone who's from a Roman Catholic tradition, Roman Catholicism does not answer any of these problems, because Roman Catholicism is kind of a mess in terms of doctrinal issues, in terms of where the church is, in terms of practices of the Mass. I think what people who leave Protestantism for Rome, what they're looking for is a couple of things. One is tradition and history, which is something that we've lost generally in our culture, which I think is a big problem. And I would like to see people return to a more historic, more confessional Protestantism, Lutheranism, hopefully, of course, from my perspective. But
not that we all have to be under the same denomination, as explained earlier. We can all be different Lutherans, but as long as we're Lutherans.
Exactly. That's the goal, right? So sorry. The other part of it is they're looking. They see the fracturing in the church, which is, as I said, a real problem. And what looks attractive to Rome is here's a unified church. Everyone feels like they can have their own opinion, their own view of everything. Everybody in our culture thinks they're an expert on everything because they can, write a blog about it or whatever. So this is a problem for the church. And Rome looks attractive in that way because they have institutional unity. But I say that's all they have is institutional unity. Because if you look at theologians in the church, there are very opposed views. I've watched, priests on Twitter kind of anathematize each other in Roman Catholicism. It's not like they're all on the same page. And, my traditionalist Roman Catholic friends are very upset about people like James Martin or the Pope himself and things that he's said. And I think what you see, and this is what Luther saw at the Reformation, is there just isn't that consistency. The idea sounds nice in theory, but when you actually look at the details and you look at the history, and, you can't tell me that the guys who, wrote the canons of the Council of Trent had the same theology as, Karl Rahner or somebody that was, involved in Vatican II. It's not the same theology. So it sounds great to say you have this consistency over these many centuries and you have this consistency under the papacy. But I think you end up really in the same place you do in Protestantism too. You just division. To some degree, I think we have to just end up saying like, this is just a result of sin, that there's division and people disagree. And are confused. I think we just have to come to that perspective. And I think when you're looking for this kind of perfect, ideal church, you're just not going to find it realistically.